Hi, I'm Megan West with My Faith Boats. So glad you're joining us today. I am very honored to have Tim Barton with us. He is the president of Wallbuilders, a historian, and he and his dad, David Barton, have a new book out called The American Story, The Beginning. So please welcome Tim Barton. Hey, Tim, how's it going?
Hey, Megan, good. Thanks for having me on.
Well, it's great to see you. And you have a new book out, and I want to talk about it because I think we're in this critical moment of really needing to understand history. So the book is called The American Story, The Beginnings. Tell us why you wrote it, and what do you mean by the beginnings in this book?
Yeah. So first of all, if anybody's not familiar with us at Wallbuilders, we do a lot with American history. We try to present America's forgotten history and heroes. We emphasize the religious, the moral, the constitutional heritage. But one of the things that makes us unique is we have what's considered the largest private collection of original documents from the founding era. We have more than 160,000 items and artifacts in the collection. Probably more than 100,000 of them are from before 1812. And so what we do is go back to the original sources and try to tell those stories. And so we've been around since 1988. I think is when my dad started our organization. And in the midst of us for years doing this, trying to help people understand some of the truth, the Christian heritage of our nation, we've done a lot of topic-driven stuff, and we've done a lot of books and a lot of CDs and DVDs and all these things that have been available for a long time. We've never really had a history book before. So a couple of years ago, I told my dad we really ought to work and put together a history book, and we started working on it. And little did we know, in God's providence, it was going to come out around the same time that the 1619 Project was coming out. And the 1619 Project came out a little bit before we had finished the book. And so in the midst of us doing the final edits, I told my dad, we need to add a few things to help tell some of the rest of the story. We were going to make it maybe a series and do a second and a third volume and just see how far it went. But I told my dad, we need to answer some of these questions now, because the 1619 Project is making some pretty horrendous accusations against America that are absolutely not historically accurate. They're not historically grounded. But if you don't know history, then you don't realize how bad of a job the 1619 Project is doing in telling the story of America. So we start with Christopher Columbus, and we roughly go through the end of slavery in America. And we try to just tell more of an honest story about who they were, what they were doing, and really even how God used them along the way. And so our starting place with our book is that everybody is a sinner who needs a savior. Mm-hmm. And the reason that matters is because as we study people from history, our expectation never should be that we're going to find perfect people from history, because apart from Jesus, right, several thousand years ago, you're not going to find a perfect person in history. What that means is, as we study history, we're never surprised by someone having a sinful or weak or fleshly moment. But we always can be impressed when we see God use one of these imperfect people and do really special and great things through them. And that's part of the story we tell along the way with America. The reason also this book is, I would say, very, very valuable right now is that so many of the people that have been traditionally American heroes for generations, whether it be a Christopher Columbus or a George Washington or Thomas Jefferson or Abraham Lincoln, so many people that were traditionally American heroes are being villainized today. And largely the way they're being criticized and attacked is with things that are not historically accurate, things that are lies. And so in the book, we go through and just tell more of the honest story, where we present that these weren't perfect people. We even highlight some of the mistakes they made along the way, but it's very evident that God used them in really special ways. And so that's where we mean from the beginning, starting kind of with Christopher Columbus, from the beginning of the story of the New World up to, and this book really to the end of slavery is where we kind of tie a bow on this book, but we're working on the second and third edition already.
Wow, it's fascinating. And I think it's something that we're so missing, is that critical component of studying history and being able to navigate what is truth and what is not. Because even a quick search on Google will come up with a lot of different perspectives from history on a particular topic. Just this morning, I was doing some research on the 400th anniversary of Thanksgiving, and we'll get into that a little bit more. But the top page, it was a perspective that was very different than what maybe I was taught in history. So how do we navigate that, looking at just this cultural moment when it seems so emotionally driven by the headlines and feelings rather than people really understanding a historical background to things?
You know, that is a great question. It's one of the challenges we're navigating right now in our culture and world, because it used to be that there was a sense of trust in people in the systems, right? It used to be that if a news anchor told us something, well, we knew they were telling us the truth. It used to be if the thought was if a professor told us something, they were probably being truthful and honest. And what we're discovering now is that that's just simply not true in a lot of regards. I remember when I'm nearly 40, and when the internet was becoming a thing in the late 90s, early 2000s, and my parents or my mom would find something on the internet and she'd say, hey, look, this is what the internet says. And I would have to remind her, Mom, just because it's on the internet doesn't mean it's true. Unfortunately, I think a lot of culture, we've just grown up in a level of trust in the institutions that now we're realizing that probably that trust should not have been placed there in a lot of regards. And then one of the challenges is if you want to discover what's true. So it's very healthy for us to question what is true. We should question what is true because the truth isn't scared of honest questions. It's only a lie that doesn't want questions to be asked because a lie doesn't want to be exposed. The truth is not insecure. So you can ask honest questions in pursuit of truth. And when you're asking those questions now, the challenge is, okay, but I'm finding all of these articles on Google. So a couple things we would tell people is, first and foremost, if you're looking for the truth historically, you want to look for as many original sources and citations as possible. So, for example, we mentioned our book, The American Story. In The American Story, we have over 1,000 footnotes. The reason that's important is because the premise we make along the way is you should not take our word for this. You should go back and see what these people actually wrote, what they actually said, what they actually did. And that's why we give original quotes and have those links to the original sources. So don't take our word for it. Go back and study for yourself. When you find an article that's going to make a claim and doesn't give you a footnote or a source, right? If it tells us, well, we know the Pilgrims believe this, the Pilgrims did this, and they don't give us a reference or a footnote or a source to verify or validate what they are saying, I'm going to instantly have questions. And it doesn't necessarily mean what they're saying is not true. It just means I'm not sure I can trust it. And until I've looked it up to verify it, I'm not going to trust it, right? It's kind of the old Reagan adage with the Soviet Union that we might trust, but we're going to verify, right? I know what they're telling us. We're going to verify to see if it's true. And this is the way it should be in general. In fact, as a Christian, if we look in the book of Acts chapter 17, this is where the Apostle Paul was speaking to the Bereans. And the Bereans were people who wanted to know what was true. And because they didn't really trust Paul. And it's really fun to kind of imagine how this would have unfolded, because what it says is that when Paul talked to them, they searched the scriptures daily to verify what he was saying was true. And so in essence, right, there's no New Testament at this point. So he's telling them from the Old Testament how the prophecies from the Old Testament were fulfilled in Jesus. And how Jesus represents what these things from the Old Testament said. And so you can imagine the Apostle Paul saying, well, we know Isaiah told this and said this. And they say, wait a second, someone get the scroll of Isaiah. And they would bring out the scroll and they'd be like, oh, that is what Isaiah says. Okay. And Paul would continue. And we know the prophet Joel told us this. Hang on, somebody get the scroll of Joel. And this is what they're doing to verify that this Paul character is not telling them something historically inaccurate. That's the way we should be pursuing the truth of history, is that whatever someone says, we should want to confirm and look it up. And the reason it's helpful having those original sources and citation in an article or in a book is if they're showing you what the source says, it gives a little more confidence in the accuracy, the truthfulness of the claim being made. Unfortunately, right now, everybody can write a blog post and very few people are going to reference and quote and cite original sources. And this is true even for things, for some noted magazine, noted art outlets, noted articles. They don't always do a good job of identifying actual original sources. And so if you're not going to show me the original source, I'm instantly going to have a hesitation of whether or not that's believable or truthful, because we just live in an era where it is a subjective climate when it comes to truth, that people say, well, here's what I think, what I feel, what I believe, or here's what's true to me. Well, that's not the way it works historically. Historically, there's objective truth. It's called original documents. What did they actually write? What did they actually say? What actually happened? And so truth is discoverable and knowable when it comes to American history. So we just have to do the diligence. Sometimes you might have to go through the second or third page of that Google or that Bing or that DuckDuckGo search. And it might take a while to find that source, but I'm not going to trust an article that's not going to give me the citation for what they're saying, because if you're not going to give me the chance to verify what you're saying, it's casting a lot of doubt and shadow that I can trust what you're actually saying.
Right. And it does take due diligence and work to find that because we live in such a quick culture of read the headline and that's what truth is. And oh my goodness, that's very scary to do in this culture. But you bring such a great point. And I think for those who don't know about your website, which you alluded to earlier, you do have such great resources there to see the original sources of things. And one of those is all the different presidential proclamations. Talk about the anniversary of Thanksgiving right now.
Yeah, one of the things I think is really lost in modern culture and in the education climate in general is the history and the legacy of Plymouth and of the Pilgrims. So often we hear about the 1619 project and we hear about Jamestown and we hear about the evils of Jamestown, which it's worth noting. A lot of the things the 1619 project says are just incredibly historically inaccurate, but that is what kids are learning now, is that America is fundamentally bad and evil because of what happened in Jamestown. They don't talk about Plymouth very much. And this is where we've lost some very significant things, because America was much more shaped by the influence and legacy of the Pilgrims and by Plymouth than it was by Jamestown. And one of the things that, as you just alluded to, at our website, wallbuilders.com, we have hundreds of original prayer proclamations from presidents, from governors, even from Congress that are up on our website. By 1815, there had been more than 1,400 official government prayer proclamations in American history from presidents or governors or Congress, et cetera, as the case was. At Wallbuilders, we own over 800 prayer proclamations. So we own a lot of original prayer proclamations. And this is one of the legacies of the Pilgrims. They started the tradition that was embraced by the New England states and then embraced largely by every colony in America. Was every fall they would have a day of prayer and Thanksgiving, and then every spring they'd have a day of prayer and fasting. And the reason was the first Thanksgiving, we're actually coming up on that 400th anniversary, and I'll come back to that in a second. But just a year or two later, they had planted crops and they had a severe drought and rain wasn't coming. And they knew if the rain doesn't come, our crops won't grow. And if our crops don't grow, we might not have the food to survive. So they called for a day of prayer, humiliation, and fasting. And they said, we just need to seek God, because if God doesn't intervene, if God doesn't send the rain, we're not going to survive. And what they did, actually, after the prayer, God did send rain. It was a miracle, and the crops grew, and they did survive. But what happened is it started a tradition that for the Pilgrims, every single spring, they would have a day of prayer, fasting, humiliation, and then every single fall, they would have a day of prayer and Thanksgiving to thank God for his provision, for what he had done. And that's actually part of the legacy we have in these original prayer proclamations. The early governors in America, early presidents in America, they would do these different proclamations. In the spring, they would do a prayer and fasting proclamation. In the fall, they would do a prayer and Thanksgiving proclamation. And this is part of the legacy going back to the very first Thanksgiving of the Pilgrims, when 400 years ago this year, the Pilgrims said, we need to thank God for God's provision. And that first Thanksgiving really is kind of awesome and bizarre at the same time, because when the Pilgrims arrived in 1620, they were trying to land in the Jamestown colony. There was a crazy storm that blew them north. They are landing in an unknown territory where they don't have food, they don't have provision, and they're landing at wintertime. There's already snow on the ground, and they're having to try to survive. Well, those Pilgrims, approximately half of them died that first winter. There was 102 when they first got here. By the time of the first Thanksgiving, which was the next year, there were only 53 remaining Pilgrims, according to the Plymouth Historic Society. And what's fascinating is, if half of your people died, what in the world are you thanking God for at this first Thanksgiving, right? Like, your parents died, your siblings died. It's kind of a bizarre thought. What are you thanking God for? And they were very clear that they were thanking God for the fact that when they had first arrived, shortly after they had been here, they met Somerset, an Indian, and he spoke some English. And he told them, I have a friend who speaks more English than me. And Somerset came back with Squanto. And Squanto was someone who was fluent in English, and he taught them how to survive in the new world. He taught them how to fish and how to hunt, how to grow crops. And because of Squanto's help, that first Thanksgiving, they actually were able to bring in a harvest where Governor Bradford thought, we will probably have enough food to survive the winter. We need to thank God that God, in his divine mercy and his incredible providence, has brought us friends and allies who have helped us learn how to survive. And now God, in his blessing and abundance, has given us provision that we probably will not starve to death this first winter, or this second winter, this first year of us being here. It's a very different thought, because they weren't thanking God for the great abundance, right? Where sometimes as Christians, we can thank God that our cup runneth over, so to speak. These were not people living in abundance. These were people thanking God that they might not starve that winter, as half of them had the winter before, but also thanking God for their allies and the friends they'd made along the way, et cetera. It's really an incredible legacy from Plymouth, but this is part of only one of many things that Plymouth contributed to the foundation of America that today is largely forgotten because we just don't spend time talking about the history of Plymouth or the legacy of the Pilgrims.
Yeah, and that's something so important that we need to remember and focus on and reflect on as we approach Thanksgiving next week. As you look at just the different parts of that piece of our history, I know that this comes up every once in a while. We'll get the comment that, well, we're founded as a Christian nation. Is that true? Is that not true? Are we still a Christian nation? Can you speak to that comment a bit that people will bring up, especially in the media today, regarding, well, we're not a Christian nation? So what have you found in history, and where does that lead?
And so that's a really fair and honest question. It's a good question. And a lot of people do wonder that, because a lot of what we hear in education today, a lot of what many of us were taught was that America was not really a Christian nation. The founding fathers weren't really religious. And the first thing I would point to is, right, when we hear these notions, the founding fathers weren't really religious, or they believed in separation of church and state, and et cetera, I would point to the fact, again, those prayer proclamations we mentioned earlier. By 1815, there were more than 1,400 official government prayer proclamations. So George Washington did them, John Adams did them, John Hancock did them, Benjamin Franklin did them, Thomas Jefferson did them. Like, we can go down the list. Everyone who was a governor, or most of the people who were presidents, had these prayer proclamations. So if the argument is they weren't really religious, well, my question is, why did they have prayer all the time if they weren't religious, right? If they didn't believe in God, why did they keep praying? And it's also worth noting that these were official prayer proclamations as they were governors or as they were presidents. So even this notion of like separation of church and state, that must not have meant to them what it means to us today, because they didn't separate faith from the public square or public arena. They actually encouraged more faith in those public areas and arenas. And this is where we would encourage people to not just take somebody's word for this. Go back and study original documents. Go back and read what these guys did. Go back. John Hancock, for example, was the first governor of Massachusetts. He had 22 prayer proclamations as governor of Massachusetts. Most people know that John Hancock was, right, the famous signature on the Declaration, the really big signature. They don't know much about him as a person, and they certainly don't know much about his faith. If we begin to study the founding fathers, not from what somebody else writes about them, not from what Wikipedia says about them, if we studied them going back to early biographies, going back to their own writings, we would see a very different narrative. Now, what is very clear historically is that America unquestionably was influenced by the impact of the Bible. The reason we had a Republican form of government, the reason that we had religious liberty in America, the reason we had the Bill of Rights, you can go through a litany of things we had in America. The reason we had those ideas, those belief systems, the reason we had private property, it was the influence of the Bible. And this is very well documented. In fact, if you look at the Constitutional Convention, when the founding fathers come together to write the Constitution, there was a group of professors, modern day professors, who said, we want to see the founding fathers, what they put together in the Constitution has been such a brilliant document. No governing document in the history of the world has lasted longer or been more successful than the U.S. Constitution. So we want to see what were the origins of the Constitution? What really influenced the founding fathers to write what they did? Where did their inspiration come from? And so this group of professors said that they were going to go back, and they said they would take 15,000 representative writings from the founding era, and they would go through those writings and they would just take sample quotes out. So every time there was a quotation in one of those writings, they would make a note of that quotation, and they wanted to see, they have the sample list. We want to see, who did the founding fathers quote the most? Because maybe that gives us an idea of what really inspired or influenced them the most. And so as they go through this list, they wrote a book, and their findings are in this book called The Origins of American Constitutionalism. It's written by Donald Lutz. He's a professor, I think, at Houston Baptist. He worked with professors at LSU as well, but either way, or Houston University. Either way, it's Donald Lutz. And as he put this work together, what he identified was the number one cited individual by the founding fathers was Charles Montesquieu. The second most cited individual was William Blackstone. The third most cited individual was John Locke. Now, Montesquieu, 8.3% of the quotes they found came from Montesquieu, 7.9% of the quotes came from Blackstone, and 2.9% of the quotes came from John Locke. He said those are the most cited individuals. However, the most cited source with more than 34% of all of the quotes was the Bible. Wow. And he even acknowledged that they only included things that were in quotation marks. And oftentimes, founding fathers would write passages from the Bible and not put quotation marks. So he even acknowledged, He said, had we included other biblical references and other scriptural references that were not in quotation marks, that number would have been much higher than 34%. Okay, it's unquestionable. The Bible was a major influence on early America and the founding fathers. Now, as far as are we a Christian nation today, it would kind of depend on how we define Christian nation. Because I would say, I would have a hard time saying America's a Christian nation, considering the fact that we have murdered more than 60 million unborn babies. I don't think a Christian nation would be confused about what a male and a female is, or confused about what bathroom they should use or who should get married. That doesn't strike me as a Christian nation. However, if you were to ask, do you think America is still influenced by some of those foundational things of Christianity? I think unquestionably, we are still influenced by the foundation of Christianity upon which our nation was built. And even today, I think there's a lot of people who don't recognize part of that foundation. One of the things that the founding fathers talked about was that Christianity challenged us to be benevolent, that we are supposed to help people in need. That's a Christian doctrine. Well, that's true in a lot of regards. When you study Christianity, we know we're supposed to treat other people the way we want to be treated, right? Love your neighbor as yourself. We know that the parable of the Good Samaritan, that if you see someone in need, even if it's someone like you wouldn't get along with, someone you don't like, if you see them in need, you should help people in need. America is the most benevolent nation in the history of the world. And it's not even close. We do more every year to help people in need around the world than anybody else does. Anytime there's a natural disaster, we are the ones who show up to help. And it's worth asking the question, well, why do we want to help people in need? Because even if you are an atheist in America, you have learned the principle that you should treat other people the way you want to be treated, or you've learned this notion that you should take care of other people. Well, those were biblical ideas. And it was that influence of Christianity that led to America being a very generous, benevolent people. This is where, again, even today, there is an influence of Christianity in our nation. And I think that influence of the Bible and Christianity is diminishing in the nation. But what I think is absolutely true and worth acknowledging now is the better a nation does at following the principles of Christianity, the better that nation will succeed on every level. And so what I would say is America's not as godly as we need to be, but the better job we do of following the Bible and getting back to what the founding fathers really tried to implement with those biblical principles, the better off our nation would be.
Right. And we as Christians need to be living out that faith and being that light and that example at all times. Well, any final thoughts for us? And again, I encourage people to get your book, but also as we approach Thanksgiving, what is maybe one particular prayer from a former president that has stood out to you that's maybe a call to action to us?
So one of the things I think of is when Abraham Lincoln, during the middle of the Civil War, he wrote his prayer and fasting proclamation. So this was one that would have been in the spring, right? Not the fall. But one of the things that he acknowledges is in our blessing, we've forgotten God. And I think one of the challenges for us is, if we remember the story of Jesus healing the 10 lepers, and he says, go show yourself to the priest. And on their way that they were healed. And one says, I need to go back and thank Jesus. And so one came back to thank Jesus. And of course, we remember the parable. Jesus says, didn't I heal 10? Where are the other 9? I think it's very easy for most Americans. We live in such blessing and abundance that we're not always as grateful as we should be, that in our prosperity or in our blessings, we've oftentimes forgotten God. And I would say one of the things that we need to remember, for the Pilgrims, for them, they weren't even living in abundance at that time. And they found something to thank God for. After half their people had died, they weren't even totally sure they were going to survive. And they said, no, but look what God is doing. And I think what we need to do a better job of as Christians and certainly as Americans is recognizing God's blessing in our life, making sure that at Thanksgiving, even though there's a great tradition of food and fellowship and sports, and actually that goes back even to the first Thanksgiving, because the Pilgrims feasted with the Indians for 3 days, and they had athletic competitions and they fellowship. So there was food, there was fellowship, there were sports. That was the beginning. But the Pilgrims started off saying, we need to make sure we remember what God has done for us and not forget the blessings that God has given to us along the way. And so that would be my encouragement, admonishment, as we come up on Thanksgiving, to not forget God's blessings, no matter where our situation is. If we're living in abundance, if our cup is running over, or if we're just praying for God to put something in our cup, we can still recognize the goodness of God, that God is a good God and God has done good things for us on our behalf. We need to be a thankful people. And this is a great time to remember to say thank you.
Amen. Well, we are thankful. There's so much to be thankful for. We're thankful for you and just your amazing background of history and just your wisdom and insight that you're sharing with us today. But thanks, Tim. The book is called The American Story, The Beginnings. I encourage everybody to get it. Go to wallbuilders.com, find out more information there. And Tim, just happy Thanksgiving and blessings to you and your family as well.
Thanks so much. God bless you guys.
All right. Thanks.